In this video, I am going to make a case to suggest that the group known as Lawyers for Justice not only represent the establishment that has ruined our country, but also presents a genuine threat to freedom. Before I begin, I wish to make clear that I am not a legal expert, nor have I sought advice from anyone in order to put forth my case, and quite frankly, I don't need it. I also wish to disclose that the content collected for this video, which will be presented in the form of screenshots, has been shortened in order to be able to point to specific examples. I am aware that context will be lacking. However, all posts have their title and date if one cares enough to investigate. I can only say that I present this video in good faith, and I will be honest in my thoughts. I will begin by presenting a post created on the 9th of October 2021, which relates to the legal case taken by the Italian restaurant Il Vicolo. While I take no issue whatsoever with the restaurant initiating a case with the assistance of Lawyers for Justice, I will highlight the submission made by their legal representative, which I find to run antithetical to individual liberty. Oisin Collins, senior counsel for the restaurant, submitted that the EU Digital COVID Certificate Regulation provided for a third category of testing. While those of us who valued individual liberty were focusing on eliminating any requirement to show private medical information, or indeed the need to present a COVID pass, in my opinion, Lawyers for Justice were focusing on a win in court. They supported a case advocating for a testing option, which would allow members of the public to present their medical test results in lieu of a COVID pass in order to gain access to goods and services. While such a case, if successful, would have presented the possibility of fully participating in society without having to take the experimental vaccination, it would still come at the cost of presenting your papers. Although this case managed to garner much support from the public, those of us who believed that presenting private medical information, whether it be a COVID pass or test results, was a step in the wrong direction. It must also be said that millions of antigen test kits would be needed to facilitate requirements, which would lead to both financial burden and indeed landfill sites full of snotty testing swabs, as well as useless masks, which would have a negative impact on the environment. It should also go without saying that the data accumulated from millions of people testing themselves daily would only serve to empower the government and their draconian laws. In this regard, I believe it is perfectly reasonable to suggest that any party advocating for presenting medical information to participate in society is a party that is akin to the government, and therefore part of the establishment. I now wish to move into the realm of freedom of speech and present a case which proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Lawyers for Justice are just as tyrannical as any politician when it comes to silencing opposition. For years, many of us have been blue in the face explaining why the suppression of freedom of speech, regardless of who is doing the suppressing, presents a grave threat to society and individual freedom. It gives those in power the right to choose what opinions are acceptable and what opinions should be criminalized. Throughout the pandemic, many of us were banned, censored and silenced for speaking our minds truthfully and honestly. But instead of taking the position that freedom of speech should be the goal, Lawyers for Justice took the position of the censor. The following 5 posts relate to various debates and interviews conducted throughout the pandemic. Although it is clear from the posts that Lawyers for Justice are merely acting on behalf of the people who made contact, I take issue with the solution proposed to appease their complainants. And their solution was to call every piece of offensive material hate speech, every offensive debate, every offensive interview, every offensive idea expressed through the spoken or written word hate speech. Make no mistake, our politicians have been fighting for years to introduce laws to limit any and all speech they deem to be hateful, and Lawyers for Justice give life to such disgusting ideas by appealing to and assisting members of the public to use the hate speech defence as a viable excuse to silence their opposition. This, of course, serves to normalize the idea that freedom of speech is dangerous and that censorship is more desirable to combat bad ideas instead of formulating an argument to do so. Needless to say, this is the position of not only most politicians in power, but the position of every megalomaniacal leftist lunatic in Ireland. Free speech is the mechanism we use in a society to bring about change through argument and persuasion, and it must be said that our politicians and our ideological opposition salivate at the prospect of being the ultimate censors. In this regard, I believe it is perfectly reasonable to suggest that any party advocating for the use of hate speech laws or supports a system by which debate can be shut down using hate speech as a defence is a party that is akin to government, and therefore part of the establishment. In this final segment, I will present 3 posts to show that lawyers for justice advocate for the government to introduce laws that seek to further expand their powers over private property. I say further expand, as our politicians have enjoyed an extortionate level of power over the right to private property for decades, and can essentially snap up property using the public purse if a case can be made resembling a loose definition of the common good. But one look at their posts, which are designed to appeal to your emotions rather than your mind, fills me with both dread and indeed rage. Dread, because I believe that lawyers for justice are disregarding the powers our government currently possess, as they highlight homelessness as a good enough reason to further empower our politicians. But it's as simple as this: the laws already in existence grant our government the power to solve the homeless crisis overnight. And if you think I am being naive, I challenge you to explain how our government can take in tens of thousands of Ukrainian refugees into our country and grant them food and shelter and medical care in what seems like no time at all. No referendum was required, and certainly a further concentration of power was also not required. But lawyers for justice, either through calculation or sheer ignorance, would lead you to believe that a vote for a concentration of power is not only necessary, but desirable. They also resort to creating villains in order to stir emotion. Vulture funds, multinationals, and billionaires. Words chosen to elicit a reaction, but when looked at carefully, represent nothing worth consideration. I would suggest that any meaningful debate with a member of Lawyers for Justice, which hopefully wouldn't be subject to hate speech, would uncover a lack of understanding of what such words mean, and indeed a lack of understanding of the constitutional supports our government can rely on to essentially do as they wish for the common good. Before closing this segment, I wish to say the following. A referendum passed to grant our government, the most inept, corrupt government in a generation, more power over property rights is a referendum passed for the concentration of power, which takes the shape of communism. And I can tell you this with great certainty. Richard Boyd Barrett, Paul Murphy, Breed Smith and other proud communists celebrate influential people like Lawyers for Justice making their arguments for them. Lawyers for Justice believe that the right to affordable housing is a human right, and that the private property of other individuals should be forcefully acquired to realise this belief. And make no mistake, one glance over the Dáil debates is all you need to understand that Lawyers for Justice make the exact same arguments for communism as the communists themselves. And I will say this: bigger the fool you to think that our government will not come for you when they have sufficiently drained the wealthy and forced them to seek refuge in freer, less punitive countries. Bigger the fool you to think that the communist is a loving, caring person with your best interests at heart, instead of the immoral parasite he actually is. In this regard, I believe it is perfectly reasonable to suggest that any party advocating for the centralised concentration of power is a party that is akin to the government, and therefore part of the establishment. In closing, I wish to ask you the following questions. Who would the politicians prefer you get your advice from? The group who argues that it is reasonable to present your papers to access goods and services, or the person who argues that such practices have no place in society? The group who believes in the concept and weaponization of hate speech, or the person who believes that government, or indeed the mob, have no right to silence offensive points of view? The group who would advocate for a concentration of power with respect to something as fundamental as your right to private property, or the person who would see the rights of the individual strengthened with respect to the ownership of private property? All things considered, I can confidently say that the group known as Lawyers for Justice represents a genuine threat to freedom and are, in my opinion, part of the establishment.